Gupta. I'll quickly take you all through his brief profile. He's a managing director and CEO of BSE Sammaan CSR Limited. He actually worked with Citibank for more than 2 decades in various positions. He has done BTech in electronics from IIT Madras and postgraduate in systems and finance from IIM Calcutta. And while actually was working with Citibank, in fact, he held various positions. He handled product management, technology, operations, and internal audit in India as well as in North America. So he is also the member of working group on social stock exchange constituted by SEBI. I'm sure we are going to get more information about the SEBI's report and actually how the entire ecosystem is going to be beneficial for the development sector in India. I must also mention that he is very passionate towards the civil society organization. It's well known, and he was indeed like a representative of civil society organization in the SEBI working group on SSC, which is otherwise just represented by just one civil society organization in that working committee. He accepted our invitation, and despite his busy schedule, is here with us today. Over to Shri Hemanth Gupta. Welcome once again, and thank you for being with us. And it's your platform.
So first of all, thank you, Dr. Basu, Ram, Dr. Basu, for having me. It's an honor to be talking to the audience here. And what I thought I'll do is actually take a couple of steps backward and talk about why a social stock exchange and why do you need a social stock exchange. And the second is to also try and talk about what the working committee discussed as far as the social enterprise, going back to the discussion Dr. Balu was having. So let's talk about why do we need a social stock exchange. Now, Girish alluded to this when he spoke about the ecosystem that gets created around a social stock exchange. The three things, to my mind, apart from technology, that a stock exchange brings. One is liability, which means that if an investor is buying shares, he is assured that when he pays his money, he will get his share. Similarly, when an investor is selling his shares, he is assured that he will get his money when he delivers the shares. The second thing a stock exchange does is it is inclusive, which means that as long as I'm able to provide the right documentation, the KYC documentation, and as long as I have the adequate qualifications that are required as an investor, anybody can invest. Right? It's not restricted to a certain number of people or certain class of people. And the third thing that a stock exchange provides is liquidity, which is that whenever I want to sell my share, there is a high probability of somebody being there to buy my share. Right? And similarly, of course, it depends on the nature of the company, the size of the company, etc. Right? But the ecosystem exists. So the structure that a stock exchange brings, the reliability, the dependability that a stock exchange brings, today does not exist in the social development ecosystem. So therefore, in order to make social development investing, and I'm loosely using the word investing. Investing, I'm not saying, going back to Dr. Balu's discussion, not necessarily for a financial return, it could be for a social return also. The attempt was to bring the same level of discipline to social development investing so that the investors are more comfortable in becoming a part of that journey. Right? And to my mind, for that to happen, the social stock exchange has to provide adequate transparency. it has to be inclusive. And inclusive, I mean both on the supply side and on the demand side. And also it has to be provide liquidity. Now, I also want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what is the demand side and what is the supply side, typically in a stock exchange. So I'm going to use the analogy of let's say a shopkeeper. Right? I, as a customer, I represent the demand side in the sense that I want to go and buy something from the shop. The shop or the shopkeeper represents the supply side. So therefore, in a stock exchange, whether it's a social stock exchange or a commercial stock exchange, the investor or the people who are putting in the money represent the demand side. And the people, in case of a regular stock exchange, companies who are issuing shares or bonds, or in case of a social stock exchange, not-for-profit enterprises or social enterprises who are coming to the stock exchange with their uh, bonds or equity or other financial instruments, represent the supply side. And therefore, what the platform actually attempts to do, just like any other stock exchange, what the social stock exchange attempts to do is it attempts to take the donors or the investors or the demand side and take the supply side, which is the NGOs, the social enterprises, and attempts to match the two. So if I have a donor or an investor who is trying to figure out that if they want to contribute money towards women's education in Maharashtra, right, they will be able to come to the social stock exchange and hopefully find NGO or bond that is addressing women's education in Maharashtra. Right? So that's the thought behind creating a social stock. Now, the other point that is of importance here is what is a social enterprise? And I think Dr. Balu spent a lot of time explaining not just the Indian perspective, but the global perspective also. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to add to what he said by explaining to you what the working committee at SEBI, the one that has created the report, thought from a social enterprise perspective. So if you look at the report, it actually clearly distinguishes between for-profit enterprises, or what the report calls social enterprises, and not-for-profit enterprise, or NGOs as we call them, which in the report are called NPOs. And I think from a ecosystem or structure viewpoint, the NGOs today have a legal structure available, whether it's a Section 8 or a society or a trust. The lacuna that Dr. Balu was pointing out was that on the for-profit side, a similar structure for a social enterprise does not exist. And I think a separate discussion, it's a topic that has a lot of merit to what Dr. Balu said, and a separate discussion should be held on that. I'm not going to talk that much about that here. So having defined why we need a social stock exchange and who will be on the stock exchange, what I'll try and do now is to take an NGO's perspective, right? And what does it mean for an NGO? To my mind, so far, and remember, the report is not trying to answer. It is, to my mind, its job is to create more questions and answer a few. Right? It's the first step. in a long journey that Dr. Balu had laid out in terms of a roadmap. So, but to my mind, where we are today, the discussion today typically happens between an NGO and a donor. Right? It's a one-to-one discussion. There is a restriction in terms of the size of the project, depending on how much the donor is able to give. There are restrictions in terms of the outcome or the impact, again, depending on what the donor is looking for. There are restrictions in terms of the timeline of the project, especially with CSR, as we all know, where it may be a initiative that actually requires 3 years of effort, but on account of what the donor is looking for, we have to restrict it to 9 months or 12 months or whatever the period that the donor is looking for. Right? What the social stock exchange does is, to an extent, it frees you up from these restrictions. Depending on the merit of your project and depending on, remember, there has to be a demand for, there have to be investors, right? So depending on the merit of your project, depending on the level of transparency you can give as the project progresses, and depending on the overall impact that a project is having, you should be able to find donors or investors. There is a flip side to it or a downside to it, which is that there may be an urge from social enterprise and not-for-profit enterprises to list on the stock exchange only the popular kind of projects or causes, because those are the ones that will generate more interest among investors. Right? But that is where inclusivity comes, where we have both on the demand side and the supply side an adequate representation of organizations or investors who are doing work across the spectrum. Now, therefore, the other implication of this is that suddenly projects of a certain scale will attract more interest. So if and therefore a single NGO that is perhaps working in one village will now have to collaborate with other organizations working on similar projects, maybe around the same area, and go together as a single bond or some other instrument on the social stock exchange. Because the social stock exchange will not be looking for raising money which is, small in value. It will look at raising money for a larger value, which I think has the effect of forcing collaboration, which to my mind, in my experience in the social development sector, is something which has been missing. I think if we collaborate, the impact will be higher, and I'm hoping through the social stock exchange, there will be a greater incentive to collaborate and come together and create projects that are larger in scale. So that's kind of an NGO from my perspective, how this impacts an NGO, small, medium, or large. And I do want to spend just 2 more minutes on what I think the next steps will be from a social stock exchange perspective. One is that clearly the final report has to come out once all the comments are incorporated. And I've been a part of several discussions, especially on the NGO side, on the social stock exchange and the contents of the report, etc. But after that, to what Girish was saying, uh, it would make sense for me to the social exchange to get housed in an existing exchange structure. Right? You do not have to build it from scratch. There already are rules, policies, procedures, systems that exist that should help us to create the social stock exchange much faster than if we had to do it from scratch. And in the interest of keeping a balance, it perhaps does make sense for us to have two social stock exchanges, uh, BSE and NSE. Right? Beyond that, I think it is easier for a for-profit enterprise or a social enterprise to become listed on a social stock exchange, because at the end of the day, that enterprise is giving a financial return, and therefore they can issue equity, they can issue bonds which have an interest rate, which may be a nominal interest rate, but they can still issue bonds. The challenge comes when you come to the not-for-profit organization, which is where the committee actually spend a lot of time deliberating. At the end, there are complex financial instruments such as social impact bonds or social development bonds that have been created that do allow NGOs to raise funds from investors who are looking for a financial return. And then, of course, the concept of a zero coupon, zero principal bond, which is a grant or a donation, in other words. I'm also hoping, and going back to my earlier collaboration point, I'm also hoping that this will result in greater number of campaigns getting created around themes which span geographies, which include small, medium, and large NGOs. And the one last comment, I'm also hoping, and this is one thing that I have been pushing personally, that the larger NGOs in this country step up to the plate and actually try and encourage the smaller NGOs and the medium-sized NGOs to understand what this means for them and to help them take advantage of the platform that is getting created. Right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think I probably should open for question and answers now.
Yeah. Thank you, Hemanth. It was